First of all, let me express my gratitude to the course directors for allowing me to do this yet a second year. So I'm amazed, actually. After the first time, I thought this was a marvelous class to be able to take as an undergraduate. It really has been an interesting trip. I've seen some of your exam questions, and I don't envy you. I thought to myself, my God, I couldn't answer these myself. But by listening to This Week in Virology, I could actually discern the answers. What?
How many different types of viral genomes are there?
That's right. How many are there? That's a very good question. I'm sure everyone in this room knows how many genomes there are and how the reproduction cycle begins. It's something that I knew that at one time, way back in my undergraduate education, but of course I drifted off into another field called parasitism, which, well, viruses are parasites, there's no question about it, but they're so small that you can't see them. I prefer parasites that you can see with your naked eye. So I worked my whole life on a parasite called Trichinella spiralis, which some of you might know as trichinosis, which, if you look at it in the proper setting, it's a very, 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 very large virus because it lives inside of a cell. But that's, another course. I wouldn't do that to this course. I don't want to waste your time here. But just know that anything that infects you, that you can almost not see or that you could see, but it isn't actually taking a bite out of you like a lion or a predator, those are probably parasites. So you can start at the very bottom of the scale of life and work right up to insects. There are some insects or arthropods that actually live inside. So today, it's nice to know where these things come from and where they're going. Now, I can't tell you where this one is going, although I can tell you where it's been. So West Nile virus is a flavivirus. So you've heard about flaviviruses, right? So what do you know about them? Come on, anybody, just shout it out. What does the word mean? Who's Greek? Anybody here Greek? No? Nobody belongs to a fraternity or sorority here? All right, so that's a good thing, actually. So the word flavi is a Greek word, and it actually means yellow. So can you name another virus in that group? Yellow fever, exactly right. And yellow fever played a huge role in the history of this country, pardon me, in the history of our medical school, because 2 of its graduates actually sacrificed their lives trying to find out which vector or insect transmitted yellow fever from person to person. And all of that was under the directorship of Walter Reed, who was a very young man at that point, but of course matured into an older person. And in fact, if you've been to Washington, D.C., there's a whole hospital and a medical complex named after Walter Reed, who became very famous for his work in the Army. He essentially allowed the Panama Canal to be built because once we found out which insect vector it was, we could begin to hone in on controlling it. Now, it shouldn't surprise you then to learn that almost all the flaviviruses, in fact, all of the flaviviruses that I can name, are transmitted by vectors or insects of some sort. Some are transmitted by ticks as well, and that wouldn't be an insect, that would be a what? An arachnid. 8 legs rather than 6 legs. It's the easy way to remember that. So if you want a vector for ticks that everybody's familiar with, Lyme disease would fall into that category, right? So that's something that you can probably get right now. In fact, if you go out walking in the woods, you're likely to pick up ticks, and the ticks are likely to have this infection inside of them because about 50% of the ticks of a particular species have Lyme disease, and they're capable of transmitting it. Is my voice okay? It tends to trail off at the end of my sentences. So West Nile virus. West Nile, where the heck is there a West Nile? I mean, I named the story that I wrote after this, the West Nile story, sort of as a little play on words, West Side story, West Nile story, but the way this actually works is kind of interesting because the West Nile virus comes from the western portion of Uganda. It's west of the Nile River. And then there are many branches to the Nile River, so The branch of the river that it's west of is this branch right over here. And here is where it was first discovered. And they've, of course, colored it in as a yellow area because it was a flavivirus. If you look now where it's found, it's extended its range. So the real question is, how did that virus ever come here? What brought it here? How did we ever get involved with it? And what are the ramifications of that? So that's what I'm going to spend most of the time talking about. Because as Vince must have told you before, I'm not a virologist. Not by training, not by avocation. I have been dragged into this subject kicking and screaming by a wonderful teacher. To be honest with you, when I was a graduate student, I went to Notre Dame for my degree. There weren't any parasitologists there that studied the ones that you can see. They were all virologists, except for me. So every Saturday we would sit around a table in the morning and listen to all of the graduate students in the other virology groups give their presentations. And finally, naturally I was last, if there was time. But it's okay, because 3 of them didn't make it through and I did, so that's the way that goes. So what we have here is a distribution map, and it might be hard to see, but it was on the courseworks, right? So you can see these things. This is an interactive map that you can actually go to and push these little red buttons, and you can find out information about the West Nile virus in that country. You'll notice now that there are little red dots all the way down through South America. There's nothing in Brazil yet, but I'm sure that it's there. They just haven't looked for it much. The point is that it never used to be here, ever, until 1999. That's pretty bizarre, right? Here's an epicenter for a disease that we can actually say started. We can almost give you the exact day that it started. There are very few other things that you can do that for in terms of infections. Another one that I won't even tell you about, though, is cholera. Believe it or not, we know exactly when that one started, too, back in the 1800s. So the transmission cycle for West Nile virus is pretty straightforward. You have to be an infected animal first, and along comes a mosquito. And the mosquitoes, how many people here have ever been bitten by a mosquito? Be honest. I should have said how many people have never been bitten by a mosquito. I want to sit next to you, or you want me to sit next to you. Well, I don't know. I always catch the mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are attracted to me, and my wife loves sitting next to me for that reason, because they're less attracted to her. Didn't you understand why mosquitoes seek out people? You tend to emit CO2 when you breathe out. In fact, you always do that. So the CO2 comes out of your mouth and sinks to the floor because it's heavier than air. And if you're sitting on your lawn chair and it's the evening and you're sipping your mint julep, watching the sunset, having a grand old time in your backyard, if it gets to be around 9:30 or 10 o'clock, go inside and finish the drink there. Close your windows, put up some screens, and you'll be fine. Welcome to Storm Door Repair. This is a changed class. This is not the virology class. Just have to give the crowd something to laugh at, you know. But we're glad you came. Trust me on this. So this is the mosquito here, and try to guess how many different kinds of mosquitoes there are in the world. It's a hard thing to guess at, but I can give you the answer. It's about 1,500 different species of mosquitoes. And not all of them prefer humans. When I say prefer, it means a lot of them, even though they don't prefer humans, will feed on humans no matter what, if they're desperate for egg production. And you all know that it's the female mosquito that does the biting, right? The male's sort of like, we made it and she went off, I don't know where she is. But they both feed on something else. They both feed on plant juices. They actually suck out the sugary portion of a plant, and that's what they use for their own food. So in order to produce eggs, you need a lot more protein than just a sugary solution. So that's why the female mosquitoes bite, because they suck your blood. They then plasmapherese it. Anybody here familiar with plasmapheresis? You're nodding your head. What is it? Yes. So that means I don't have to explain a lot. They can just talk to each other and find out the whole thing, right? So plasmapheresis is right. You take the formed elements out of the blood, And you pack them down, and those are packed, they're called packed red cells. But you can also see this little buffy coat on the top of the packed red cells, those are the white cells. Then all that other stuff above that, that's the plasma. So this mosquito species, all of the females, they pack the blood cells into their diverticula, in their abdomen, and they throw away the serum part. They don't want it. They just store the red cells, and then they digest them, and then they use that protein to make eggs. So that's why they bite us. They live for about 2 weeks. They're all aquatic insects. Every one of them has to breed in the air, basically, and then lay their eggs on water. Each of those 1,500 species of mosquitoes is like watching each of us go to a Wendy's salad bar. Where did that come from, right? Well, that's okay, because if this whole class, including the 2 professors in the back and myself, lined up with a big plate and the salad bar at Wendy's, because I think it's got lots of variety at least, and we all finished. You sure you're done? Yeah, all done. Sit down. And you separate everything back out again, no 2 of us would have the same amount of anything on our plates. It's true. Just watch that sometimes. It's a nice sociological study. That's the way mosquitoes feed. Each one of us could be a different species of mosquito. And each one of these little items could be animals in their environment. And so each one of these has an individual biology that you have to pay attention to. It's just not a mosquito, it's a mosquito. So which one was the one that carried yellow fever, that cost the lives of 2 medical students at PNS back at the turn of the century? It turned out to be the yellow fever mosquito, as they came to name it. It was called Aedes aegypti. It's a very special breeding site. Breeds in temporary bodies of water. But that's not what transmits the West Nile virus. It's a different mosquito. And it's one which is distributed almost all over the world because we made it happen. We actually distributed this mosquito with our bad habits. We are the sloppiest animal on the planet when it comes to water. We love to pollute it. And there's a mosquito that was selected for life in polluted water. It's our best friend, or we're its best friend. They're not our best friend. And it's the Culex group of mosquitoes, okay? It's not the kind that transmit malaria, and it's not even the kind that transmits yellow fever. This is the kind that transmits other encephalitides. These are viruses, almost all of which are flaviviruses, but not all of them. You've got Japanese bee encephalitis, you've got lacrosse virus, you've got, come on Vince, help me out here, I'm going to go down a big list. Equine encephalitis, both Western and Eastern, those are nasty infections. And then you've got the West Nile infection, which is not so nasty depending on how old you are. So it's primarily a parasite of horses and mosquitoes. Nah, that's not true. It's a primarily a parasite of insects and humans. No, that's not true either. It's a parasite of birds. It's a bird parasite, just like lacrosse virus is a bird parasite. And St. Louis encephalitis is another one of those flavigroup viruses, and that too is a parasite of birds and mosquitoes. So did you know that mosquitoes fed on birds? Yeah, probably hadn't thought about it, right? Why would you think about it until just now? So it will bite birds if birds are present, but if birds are not present, then these other 2 groups of animals will serve as blood donors in a pinch. Now, if we look back in history and look at the discovery line for the introduction of this virus into the New World, we can begin with 1937, when it was first discovered by some British and Scottish investigators working in East Africa. And in Uganda, they were working in the West Nile district, looking for the causative agents of sleeping sickness. Now, you all know what sleeping sickness is. It's like maybe a half hour from now in this classroom. But we're going to do our best not to give it to you. So it happens all the time in medical school. I taught 38 years at our medical school, and I could always depend on some students demonstrating sleeping sickness in the audience because they were hiding behind the New York Times, but you could see the Times going, that's how you knew. So But they made a mistake. This woman was not suffering from sleeping sickness. She was suffering from something else. How did they know? Because she didn't go into a coma. She just got sicker. She didn't go into a coma, which you would do in sleeping sickness, right? It's okay, you can still yawn, it's fine. Just the suggestion of sleeping sickness makes people. What they found out, it was something brand new that they had never seen before. So they took some blood back to their laboratories and they started to experiment with it to find out what it might be. This was in the golden age of discovery of viruses. You know, we knew about parasites that you could see with your naked eye back in the 1700s, of course, tapeworms. And then in the 1800s, we learned more about microbes that you couldn't see, but you could still grow them. Those were the bacteria. And now we were into stuff that you couldn't see and you couldn't grow, and they ended up being called filterable agents, right? You had a sort of an introductory lecture on this one, I'm sure. So if it passed all the tests and it still infected you, it had to be something that you couldn't even see with a regular microscope. It took an electron microscope to see these particles of things, and we're still having our discussions on TWIV as to whether these are life forms or whether they're chemicals that take advantage of life forms. Who cares? The fact is you get them, and you get sick sometimes from them, right? So they discovered that this was one of those agents, a filterable agent. And by 1951, the Israeli scientists, now that there was an Israel, began to work on this parasite. Why do you think? This was a brand new country, for gosh sakes. Why would they be interested in a disease that they discovered in Africa? I mean, that's, you know, kind of silly, isn't it? Except that because they were living in the Middle East and the birds were flying out of Africa to their nesting grounds in Asia, they would stop off in Israel, have a bite with a few geese, pass the time of day, teach them a few languages perhaps, and share their diseases with the local mosquitoes. They'd say, you know, we'd love to stay, but we're a life nesting pair of storks and we've got to go lay our eggs. So be good, see you when we come back. In the meantime, of course, then the mosquitoes would bite the regular geese, and sometimes the mosquitoes would bite people, like soldiers living in the middle of the Negev desert on training missions that were sloppy with their water, attracting this particular genera of mosquitoes, the culicines, particularly Culex molestus in that case. And they would get infected. Not a good thing, because they had other things to take care of besides just doing exercises in the middle of the Negev. That's remaining true even today. It's sad to say, but it's still true. The biggest outbreak of this infection that became known as the West Nile virus occurred in South Africa. In 1973, it was huge. It infected 3,000 people. That doesn't sound like a lot, right? I mean, 3,000, it's a lot, but it's not a lot. But if I tell you that for every infection that becomes a clinical case, there are about 200 people that got infected but didn't exhibit the disease itself. Clinicians refer to it as an inapparent infection. That's an incredible number of people then, right? That's 3,000 times 200. That's 60,000, right? Is that right? 600,000 exactly. Okay. I have a fact checker in the back. So 600,000 people during this summer of heat wave after heat wave, followed by an enormous downpour, resulted in the world's largest outbreak. But, doesn't hold a candle to some of the ones that we've had lately. So we've got the world's record on this one. In 1999, then, the next time anyone cared about this thing was the summer that it was introduced into the United States. And so we'll spend some time talking about how that might have occurred. Well, you don't know for sure how it occurred. We just know this, that if you look back throughout 100 years of U.S. weather history, 100 years, that's all we've got, because before that the instruments were not reliable. This infection occurred during the hottest, driest summer on record for 100 years. Think that's climate change? Probably not, but it's an abnormal weather pattern, that's for sure. So from about the 1st of May until August 3rd, it might have rained a half an inch of rain the whole summer. Anybody who was alive in 1999 here? Besides just a couple of you, really? How old were you then? I won't even ask. But if you were old enough for your parents to take you to the zoo, you might have seen the visiting lowland gorillas from Central Africa. They had 19 lowland gorillas at the Bronx Zoo that you could go see behind an enormously thick piece of plexiglass that was longer than this room. And you could press your nose up against it. And they could come over and press their nose up against it, which they did a lot of, because they were on tour. They were actually on vacation. They were waiting that night to go to the latest Broadway show, I'm sure. But in the meantime, they would say, come on over here. Look at these strange bipeds. They don't have any hair. Look at their funny faces. And they're looking at us like we're something weird or something. I mean, we're just gorillas. It attracted 3 million people. It's a lot for a summer. And it was hot, 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 and dry, dry, dry. And people were being bitten by mosquitoes, which were breeding in the Egyptian goose pond, which was right next door to where this exhibit was. And if you want to talk about polluted water, I can show you. This is so polluted you could have walked on it. It was ugly water. But the Egyptian geese didn't care. And Culex pipiens just adored it. They thought it was fantastic. So my hypothesis is some little Israeli kid came from a kibbutz that had just recently experienced an outbreak of West Nile virus in the geese. Yes, that happened. And they came here in northern Queens to visit their relatives, and they said, we're going to take you to the zoo and show you the gorillas. You can see 19 lowland gorillas. They're all there. Well, okay. I would have said, yeah. And so they're waiting online, and the little kids, they've all got short pants on, and they're just slapping themselves like crazy for these mosquitoes that are not ordinarily day biters. But in this case, they made an exception because of the bonanza of people that just stood there and took it. Birds began to die at the zoo. Crows, blue jays, robins outside the zoo. The birds that died inside the zoo are special, though. We'll get to that. They didn't just come from any place. The ones that died did not come from Africa. Only the African birds survived. And you'd think they would have noticed that, but there were African birds next to Asian birds, next to South American birds. The South American flamingos died. The African flamingos lived. But when they took the survey, they said, well, some of the flamingos died and some of them lived. And that doesn't make any sense because we think this is a new virus. We don't think this is an old virus. Why? Well, all of our birds are adapted to this virus. The one they thought it was, St. Louis encephalitis, which it didn't turn out to be. All of the crows and all the blue jays and all the robins would have survived that infection, no problem. People still got sick from it, but the birds were okay. But for a newly introduced agent like West Nile, people died and birds died. Immediately they thought there was two separate things. So, you could become House for a moment, right? House would have gotten it like that. He would have. I know he would have. But he wasn't around then. He was just a hut at that point. So, from 1999 to 2010, that's only 11 years. 11 years. Come on, you guys have been around for that long. I know, I can see it. Where were you 11 years ago? It's not a good question to ask. So, but you know where you've been. And if you come from all over the country, it doesn't matter where, as long as it's within the contiguous United States, you have heard of this infection because there has been an infection in your state. But it all started right here. I mean, not far from here. Northern Queens, South Bronx. Okay. Now, the other thing about this infection is that it affects older people rather than younger people adversely. So if you're a little kid standing on line waiting to see the gorillas and you've got a raging West Nile infection going on in your brain, the reason why you don't suffer so much from it, although you might have a fever, who would know? What little kid would say, I don't feel so great. I don't think I want to go see the gorillas. Come on. You just got in there, you're going to get free candy, get some soda, they'll take you out, they'll keep you up late because they want to show you off to all their relatives. And it was hot, 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 right? And here at the gorilla exhibit, they had sprayers that would keep you nice and cool, nice and moist for the mosquitoes to come along and take a bite. So these little kids wouldn't have suffered much, but the adults, if we had it, well, there's a mortality associated with adult infections for this. And the reason for that is that when your brain swells up and you're old, you have these sawtooth joints in your skull and they just don't want to move. But as a kid, you've still got lucky. You're at that age right now, a little bit older and you won't be there, but right now, your brain has some wiggle room still. There's a softness associated with those sawtooth joints. As a little kid, a newborn has got a big hole in their head. The bone hasn't even closed up yet. Why? Because otherwise it can't get out of the birth canal. So all of this relates to the mortality of this infection. Low age groups here, high mortality and morbidity there. Even though everybody's being bitten. So if you want to know what the mortality rate is, here's the normal cycle. If you're a crow, you're toast. That's the end of it. 100%. That's an incredible percentage, right? Vince, what is another virus that has a very high mortality rate? Vince knows the answer to that, so I'm not going to give him any points for knowing. But who knows, if you had a choice of any viral infection, which one would you choose the least? Ebola. No, it's only 40%. Lassa, 30%. HIV, without therapy, it's 100%. That's a good one. Not 100%. You know some people that have it, got the syndrome, and then recovered? So say how many percentage of HIV? Come on, there's another virus. Who said rabies? That's 8. Well, it's probably 100% without radical therapy. And the way they did this one is they put this guy into a hypothermic condition for about a month until your immune system could catch up to the virus and kill it. And then they restored his body temperature and he lived. But he was brain damaged and it wasn't nice. So Louis Pasteur became famous for making a vaccine against it so that we wouldn't have to suffer from that, right? Horses, 40%, and only 3 to 5% for humans. Okay. You know what a group of crows is called? Someone actually wrote a very nice melodrama about murder using the term a murder of crows because it's part of naming groups of things, right? An exaltation of nightingales, for instance, is the one everybody seems to want to remember. But if you call this group a group of crows is called a murder of crows, how ironic it is that now that we've introduced the West Nile virus to this country, the crows are being murdered, so there is no more murder of crows because we've... thank you. So mosquitoes, the real villain of this episode, because without mosquitoes you won't have transmission to people, at least of West Nile. I want to tell you something else. I said I'd never go backwards, but I had to go back for this one. If even one of these crows gets infected from a mosquito bite, in 3 days, they'll be dead. But on day 2, when all of these crows seek out a tree and rook in the tree overnight, and have you experienced this at home? And the people hate crows at night because they come into the tree. It's like watching an Alfred Hitchcock movie, right? And then, of course, the next morning they all have to wake up and go somewhere else. So they wake you up in the morning too early and they don't let you go to sleep when you want to. When they're in the trees and they're breathing out in a steady rate, all that CO2 is traveling down the branches of the tree, down the trunk, into the grass, and it's waking up their vector. That's like hearing and smelling bacon in the morning, unless you're Orthodox. So these crows are sitting ducks for this mosquito species, which just sits in the grass and waits. And that isn't going to happen until around 10 o'clock at night. And that's why I told you that if you could get inside at around 9 o'clock at night and still take your mint julep inside, you'd be fine. But in that year, people were so hot and so exhausted by just sitting around during the daytime that there were lots of lawn parties that went on at night in New York. Lots of them. especially in northern Queens, where you have in-ground swimming pools. Cool. Half of the people left. It was so hot they went on vacation and went somewhere else. And to save money, because Con Ed was so draconian in their billing, that they actually upped the rates. And you know what they said? They had a great excuse for that. They said, we're upping the rates for electricity to save in electricity. You think you're going to stop using the air conditioner because it's 120 degrees out? And it's 80% humidity? No, you'll just end up paying a lot more money, right? So Con Ed raked it in that summer. Boy, did they rake it in. But not from half of the people living in northern Queens, because they turned off the pumps to their swimming pools, shut down their houses, and went, I don't know, to Ireland, which would have been a great place to go, or up to Canada someplace, or maybe to, I don't know, Jackson Hole, some little dump out west, who knows. So the point is that these pools became breeding sites for mosquitoes. No more chlorine, no more circulation. Leaves were dropping in because they were rotting off the trees because there was no water. The fall came a lot earlier than usual. The nutrients cycle started. The water was acceptable. And now imagine sitting out in August at 10, 11, 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. It was Friday night, Saturday morning. And people are just getting bitten like you wouldn't believe. Amazing. So that's possibly the explanation for why it got established. We had some mosquito jokes, all spoiled by the fact that you could have access to these files before I lectured. I should have left them out and just shown you them. But Gary Larson has had a wonderful field day with mosquito jokes, but mosquitoes are not a joke. If you could make them go away, the world would probably be a better thing, but a lot of other animals would suffer greatly from not having a food source of mosquito larvae or mosquito adults, but our lives would be certainly much easier. This is the culprit. And I'm overemphasizing it because of the epidemiology of this thing. Culex pipiens is a night feeder, all right? So one of the Gary Larson cartoons shows this gigantic mosquito. Yeah, it's probably not that big, but they feel that big. And if you're from New Jersey, they are that big. It's our national bird, in fact. If we want to know where the virus came from, well, then that's pure virology. It's a living laboratory. Here's how you find out. You get a viral particle and you start to sequence it, and the next thing you know, you can match it up with something that already exists, and you say, it's that one. But it wasn't actually quite that easy because we only had 7 deaths. None of the birds were looked at right away because they all thought it was something else. They were sent out to the vet lab in Iowa. The vet lab in Iowa never talks to the CDC in Colorado, which is where the vector biologists were. And so as the group in Iowa inoculated the dead bird tissues and the extracts into other living birds, they, of course, got them to die. And then they would extract their blood and tissues and prepare them for virology. And they all came down with exactly the same shaped viral particle. It's about 40 nanometers, looked just like a flavivirus. Wow. So they called up the CDC in Colorado and said, could you please send us all of your antisera for flaviviruses, because we know that there was a weak cross-reaction with St. Louis encephalitis virus, which is a flavi, but it was weak. We think that we isolated the agent, and if we could have all of the antisera, I bet you we could identify which flavivirus this was, because they didn't have any sequencing capacity. Too bad. So the answer came back from CDC, actually, we'd like your virus. Send it to us and we'll do the sequencing. No, but okay, so they were coerced into doing this, right? So they sent them the virus, and Dwayne Gubler was the chief virologist who was an expert on dengue fever. Oh, another flavivirus. And they began sequencing this. But in the meantime, of course, from some of the brain tissues of 3 of the dead people from northern Queens, 7 died altogether. 1 actually was from Toronto, stopped in New York, probably went to the zoo, saw the gorillas, got back on an airplane, went to Toronto, and died. How unusual is that? Very. But luck of the draw. So this tissue then was deposited, the brain tissue, was deposited in the state of New York's Department of Pathology. And then in California, a virologist by the name of Ian Lipkin, who you might recognize because he's here now, requested some of those samples. He said, maybe I can get some sequence out of the brain tissue of what's causing this disease. So how would you even start doing that? You'd take a non-specific primer, thinking it's a virus of some sort, and hope for the best. Well, guess what? In 2 days of intensive work, they got a partial sequence. And they put it up on ProMed. It's a program for monitoring emerging diseases that Stephen Morse established, another guy from Columbia. And lo and behold, Vincent Deubel, him, at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, said, I know what it is. This is a partial sequence of the West Nile virus. Oh, it's the West Nile virus. Oh. And the next day, of course, they had almost completed the full sequence. When they sent that full sequence to Vincent, he said, I know where this comes from. It comes from Israel. How the hell do you know that? How would you know that? Oh, because somebody also sent us some samples of geese tissue to Paris to find out which strain of virus was the outbreak of that year, 1999. And bingo, these two viruses were different by one base pair. A single base pair. Do you think that was a sequencing error? I do. Because the next closest virus was 10% different in terms of its number of base pairs. You don't make a 10% sequencing error. You can make a 0.0001% error, though. So it had to come from, it was probably from the same outbreak. So how could that virus from Israel get to New York? Do you know how many people take El Al Airlines over the summertime? Per week, it's 300,000 people. 300,000 people travel back and forth between Israel and the United States. That's a lot of people. So one of those people had to be a little kid, viremic, came to visit, went to the zoo, inoculated the mosquitoes at the zoo and the mosquitoes in northern Queens, and the next thing you know, we had an outbreak. Now, I made that up, by the way. I just made that up. So you don't have to write it down. But when I had the lunch with Vincent Deubel in White Plains, when the government sponsored a West Nile virus symposium the following spring, in the year 2000, I sat next to Vincent because he thought I spoke French because I have a French name. That was not French. And he knew that right away. So he was very kind. And he says, I like your story. He says, that's what I think happened too. Everybody else was saying birds blew across the Atlantic off their flyways, or they had stowaway mosquitoes in airplanes, which is possible. Possible. But in two different places, come on, the airport isn't that close to those two places. So it really doesn't jive with the facts. And there are no facts to tell us exactly what happened, but this is the best hypothesis that we can tell you about. And here's Ian, and here's Tracy McNamara. She was the zoo pathologist that said this has got to be the same virus, even though there are two groups infected, birds and people. I think this is the same virus. And of course, they laughed at her because the tests at the CDC in Atlanta had shown a weak cross-reaction with St. Louis encephalitis, which never kills birds. It just makes people sick. So it can't be two things. No. Or rather, it can't be the same thing. It has to be two things. So she was actually vindicated. In the long run, she was. So let's see what this thing looked like then. Just take a look at these maps just briefly. And here's the very first outbreak map. This was 1999, 62 total cases, clinical cases, times 200, right? That's how many total infections. The next year, 21 cases, less. Why? I know why. I can raise my hand. Because it was the wettest, coolest summer on record for 100 years. The year before that, it was the hottest, driest. The very next year, it was the coolest, wettest. Climate change? No, you still can't do it like that. Climate change is long term. But these are weird perturbations in weather. And they affect the outcome of lots of things, including diseases. The next year, we had 66 cases, but look at now we've got some virus infections in the south. How did it get down there? It's part of the flyway. It's also part of the highway. How many people go down south in the winter to get away from the winter? Lots of people, right? So you could imagine mosquitoes wintering over in your car trunk, taking them down to Florida and these areas, and then opening your trunk, and out comes the mosquitoes, and then you can introduce them this way. But I'll show you another way, too. 2002, we had a heat wave that you wouldn't believe, but not in the east so much as in the Midwest. And 4,000 cases, that's more than South Africa. You multiply that times 200, you've got 800,000 cases, or 800,000 infections, rather. The next year, oh, even better yet. You know, we're good at this. We're good at this. The United States is very good at catching West Nile virus. 6,800 cases, and with lots of deaths. Another year, just another year later, and only Washington and West Virginia and some of the New England states didn't report infections or cases that year. But look, as you move this map again and again, eventually all of the states come into register. There isn't a single state now that hasn't recorded some cases of West Nile infection throughout the entire country. This is the latest one that we had to add just yesterday, because it wasn't available, I guess. I looked for it, I didn't find it until yesterday at least. So you've got two different groups of things here. The light green is the presence of the West Nile virus in wildlife and mosquitoes, and the other part, the darker groups, the darker green, is the number of people and the places where they were infected. And we had about, I think it was about 350 cases altogether of West Nile. But in every single instance, it happened where it was dry, dry, hot, hot. So, you know, I told you that mosquitoes are aquatic breeders, right? So if it's hot and dry, where the hell is the water coming from? It's coming from the golf course faucets. It's coming from the graveyards where you would put a little water in the container and the flowers for your loved ones as a memorial. It's coming from the little kid's swimming pool that didn't quite get emptied. It's coming from the old tire that didn't quite get emptied. It's coming from the bird bath that's kept on because you feel sorry for the birds because they don't have a place to go. That's true. It's true. Come on. You know this is true. So now a summary of this information, quite remarkable actually. In 11 years, we've had a total of 30,702 cases. We've had 1,203 deaths for a 4% mortality rate. In the beginning, it was over 10%, and it reduced over the third year. The mortality rate went from about 8% in half to 4%, and it's stayed there ever since. But there's one place where it's still pretty high. I'll give you one guess as to which state has the highest mortality rate, and it hasn't changed throughout the entire epidemic. Not California, it's Texas. Texas. And I'll try to say something about that. We've had a total of 6 million infections with West Nile. Is this enough for herd immunity? Is the country now totally protected because there's lifelong immunity here? Or at least long immunity? You can't read that joke, but it shows a mosquito, a pair of mosquitoes, and they're flying over what looks like mosquito bumps. And they're saying, this place is all sucked out, let's go somewhere else. Have enough people become infected to protect all the others that have not become infected yet? We don't know. Guess what? What day is today? May 2nd. Time will tell. All you have to do is wait. And if it's a droughty year in some places where big epidemics have already happened and nothing happens, and those same people are still there, it's probable that herd immunity has kicked in and is starting to protect this country against big outbreaks. But it took us a long time. This joke appeared pretty early on in the outbreaks. You're going, it wouldn't kill you to go out and get outside and get some exercise. Well, when the mortality rate was 10%, it just might have. So what have we learned from all of this? Why the rapid spread west? Well, it wasn't because the wind was blowing the mosquitoes from east to west, because it blows in the opposite direction. So if you're a mosquito and you go up into the air column, you find yourself out over the Atlantic Ocean. Birds migrate north and south, so that's probably not going to be it either. You're not going to take infections from here and go all the way over here by bird migrations. And besides, birds are getting sick and they're dying, so it's kind of hard to fly when you're sick. There is one way, though, that I can think of. It's complicated, but it probably is going to turn out to be the case, because somebody actually introduced a genetic marked mosquito here and traced it all the way across the country, and it only took about 2 years. Not bad. So how does that work? All right, ecologically. Many here have a course in ecology. Do they give courses here in downtown campus in ecology? Directly, like it says ecology, and not city urban life or, something spun off in another direction. This is real ecology. All right, did you take the course? Excellent. Do you know what this word means? I didn't think so. Not too many do, but if you're our age, like the three of us, this is an a cappella singing group. The ecotones, this would have been a great sound, singing in the boys' room. But it turns out that what ecotones are borders between separate ecosystems. Can you think of an example of that? And I can. You build a highway through a forest. Lots of them, right? You had an intact ecosystem, the forest, and you cut it in half with this road, and the next thing you know, you've got unusual things growing alongside the road and unusual animals that only occupy that zone. That's bizarre, but that's the way it is. That's called the edge effect. You might have known the ecotone as the edge effect. Yes. Okay, we had a connection here. So we've built up these road systems with federal dollars, particularly after the Second World War. So we've got all these east-west roads, and we've got all these north-south roads. And those are the ecotones that I think are transmitting this infection from one place to the next. Because crows are the main host, and crows eat alongside the road. And what are they eating? They're eating bugs that bounce off your windshield, mainly. That's what they're eating. Or, you see them eating on a carcass, and you'll say, they're carrion eaters. Well, they are and they're not. You know what they're doing? They're picking the contents out of the stomachs of the animals that died. It sounds pretty disgusting, but that's the way the crow is, all right? So that's mainly what they eat. And if they're in a pinch, they'll eat the carcass too, but mostly they don't have to, because they have a rich supply of insects that are being supplied to them daily by all this interstate transportation. So here's some other crows for you to contemplate. That's why I put them in, okay. But did you know what that group was? Who knows what this group is? Counting crows. Excellent, excellent. And this one, of course, it's self-labeled. And of course, this guy used to work for us. That's Michael Crow. He's now the president of Arizona State University. So some of us do pretty good afterwards, right? Because we came from a good place. And it'll happen to you too, I'm sure. So we have other birds that get infected besides crows. We got blue jays. We got robins. I love this little kid. Isn't he just adorable? Couldn't you just pinch him in the cheeks? Wouldn't you just take him to the zoo to see the gorillas? I would. This one I'm not sure about. He's a little, I don't know. So what triggers the infection in people then? If this mosquito likes birds, why does it go to people? It's a very good question. So hot, 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 dry, dry, dry. If it's that for more than 2 weeks and the temperature goes above 90 degrees, you can depend on a human case, but not before that. So let's say it's hot, hot, and it's dry, dry, and you're a bird. You can stand about a week of this. Your food supply starts to shrink up. Your water supply starts to disappear. It's a no-brainer. You're just going to fly somewhere else. You can fly. Yes, you can fly. Frequent flyer miles. No, you can just fly. Just get up and fly. So go away. Go where the water is. Go where the insects are. Go where the flowers are. If that's what you eat. So that's what the birds do. This really pisses off the Culex pipiens population, however, because that's their food supply. What are you going to do now? I don't know. What do you guys do when you get low on money? So you look at the Drought Watch, which is a USGS website, and you match up the drought sites with the case outbreaks, and you've got it. That's easy. And it works. Here's our hypothesis. You can read all this stuff. It's pretty simple stuff, actually. It just means that when it's cool and wet, the birds stick around and the mosquitoes have all the food they want. And when it's hot and dry, the birds go away and leaving us. And then they, hey, do you really want to eat a human? It's not safe, but we'll do it anyway. So here's the actual data for this that I had one of our students at the School of Public Health collect. Here are the cases in blue, and here's the temperature here for a drought that occurred in the Midwest. And there was a 1-to-1 correlation between 90-degree temperature first day and above, bless you, 3 to 5 days later, a human case of West Nile. Why would the temperature matter? The ambient temperature, mosquitoes live at the ambient temperature. They're infected with viruses. For every 10 degrees of increase of temperature, what's the biochemical rate increase? Anybody? Saul's giving me the peace sign. He usually gives me the peace sign. Well, it's almost a peace sign. It's a half of a peace sign. No, but in this case, it was a thank you. That was a Dick Cavett reference, by the way. So he says, it's such a friendly city when he first came here from the Midwest. He says, everybody was giving me the peace sign. I would hail a cab, he would give me the peace sign. He said, well, it was a half of a peace sign, actually. So he said, for every 10 degrees of temperature, the reaction time doubles. And that's true for manufacturing mosquito viruses as much as it is for manufacturing mosquitoes. So the load of virus that it can inject into you goes way up from 80 to 90 degrees. And apparently that matters, okay? Now, no one's ever done the experiments to actually prove that in humans. They did in Israel in birds. And birds need far less. Why is that? Think of a good reason for that. What's the body temperature of humans? Most of us, not him, but most of us. It's 98.6. What's the body temperature of birds? Higher. So as soon as that virus enters the bird, whoop, it's jacked its rate up a little bit. Sometimes pretty high. So here's the way the mosquitoes look at all this. This is the view of the world through the eye of the mosquito. Okay? Here's a mosquito looking at crows thinking, steak. That's what we would think if we saw the crow, right? But you've seen this joke. That's no fair. I don't get a chance to surprise you with this. Because here's what they see when there's no more birds around and they have to bite a person. But you've all recognized this person, right? Because he says, whoa, where'd all the birds go? Oh, hell, reproduction trumps, little play on words, good taste every time. So you got to reproduce no matter what. Is it that offensive a joke? I'm sorry. She's a relative of Don. That's okay. So, you know, of course, when I made this joke up, just to let you know that mosquitoes won't bite people unless there's nothing left. That's the point here. So you have to say, what would drive away birds? Besides hunters or poison? They did some poisoning of birds in Central Park in 1999, which was a red herring. It threw off everybody because they were trying to eliminate a particular toxin that exterminators were using to kill cockroaches. And it looked like little rice grains. And they said, but animals will eat this and think it's rice and they'll die. Yeah, I know. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And so the state legislature was meeting to actually ban it at the request of the Audubon Society when they decided to do a little demonstration as to how serious they were about keeping this poison. So in 5 separate city parks, on one day, hundreds and thousands of birds were dead, eating these little pellets. And so then they thought, well, maybe they're dying from that. But of course, that wasn't the case, but it threw them off a little bit in 1999. They never caught those people, by the way. So what's the difference between Donald Trump and a hot dog? Oh, but you saw that joke. Come on, you're just being polite. My wife is right about this then. She said, no one laughs at your jokes. They're just being polite. She's probably right. So what about the change of mortality rates? It went up to as high as 15%. If you threw out Texas, it was around 7%. So what do you think the difference is between Texas and California? It's not the same as hot dogs and Donald Trump. There's something in common between Texas and California. They both accept lots of migrant workers in the summertime for farming. So if that's the case, the farm workers come from the same places, depending on what the workload is and what the kind of crop is. And so they go to both places. And then it's hot, 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 it's dry, 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 hot, 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 welcome back. Hot, 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 dry, dry, dry in Texas and in California. And so in California and Texas, they start to get sick. I see what you're going to say. Which state has the best health care system? California or Texas? I'd rather be sick in California. That's what this means. If you're sick in California, they're going to rush you to a hospital, and they will treat you. In Texas, they will try to take you back home so you can get excellent care in your own little village south of Nogales, which isn't even in Texas, by the way. It's near Arizona. So Texas is draconian in their treatment of migrant workers, and California is less draconian. They don't pay them enough, of course, in either case, but at least in California they get better health care. But something happened right over here to the virus. So this is really hard to read, so I guess I'll have to read this one for you. I think I brought my glasses. No, I didn't. So the first article I wouldn't show you no matter what, because it cost $45 to buy. And I said, thank you, but no thank you. $45 for a single article? Come on, I've published textbooks that don't cost that much. Well, but it may not be worth that much either. That's another way to look at it. But this one here says multiple pathways to the attenuation of West Nile virus in southeast Texas. Thank God it happened there, right? In 2003. And so what they did was they analyzed all of these different strains of the West Nile virus from all over the state, and they found 3 separate groups of mutations in separate places in the viral genome, and none of them had anything to do with what they thought the virulence factors were for the virus. But in every case, the virulence of the virus went down. So obviously it must have something to do with the virulence, but they don't know what it is. 3 separate point mutations that resulted in a change of death rate in people, not in crows. So we're nearing the end here, right? I've got, how much more time? Oh, time for questions. So we have lots of unanswered questions. You can ask these questions if you want, but we don't have any answers. We have a lot of outbreak data, not just in this country, but it's all over the Mediterranean basin, because that's where the birds come up out of Africa to go to lay their eggs, raise their young, come back. There's a lot of outbreaks in Russia, lots in Spain, Italy, in the Camargue region of France. So from my perspective, I have 2 big worries, right? I love being outdoors. I love wandering nature. I'm a high-risk person here for severe effects of this virus, so you have to weigh the odds. I don't like hot, hot, dry, dry anyway, so that's okay. But if you live in Scottsdale, anybody ever been to Scottsdale, Arizona? I'll give you the mantra for Scottsdale, Arizona. It's hot, 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 dry, 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 rich, rich, rich. It's where the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture is for the summer, Taliesin West. And I had a very nice experience there. But it's also where a lot of retired people go. And it's only got 217,000 people, almost half of them are between the ages of 45 and 65 years old. And none of them are from Scottsdale. And what do you think they like to do in Scottsdale? Golf. What a waste of time. Okay, golf is a great sport, but look at where they are. They're in the middle of a goddamn desert. What the hell are you doing playing golf in the middle of a desert? And they want it to look like it's not in the middle of a desert, so they water the heck out of it, and they have greens and fairways and lots of dripping water, lots of discarded water. Well, they're their own worst enemies then, because I can predict with surety that eventually a West Nile virus outbreak will occur there. In fact, I'm predicting the past because it happened last year. The other thing I worry about a lot is exotic western birds. Have you visited the Everglades? Yeah. You see the spoonbills and ibises and storks and stuff? Isn't that cool? It's great. We've got a country that has that stuff in it, right? We didn't make ladies' hats out of all of it. We tried, but then they switched fashions or something else, and so we stopped that. So all these exotic birds are down there, and we know that they're highly susceptible to this infection. I had the privilege last week and a half ago to visit Wisconsin on Earth Day, right? Or I guess it was April 20th. And so April 21st, I had nothing to do because my ticket was for April 22nd. So I took a trip out into the countryside, and I stumbled on the International Crane Recovery Center. There are 15 species of cranes. The sandhill crane is the native to this area. But there are 14 other species, Siberian cranes and wattle cranes and royal crowned cranes, and I saw every one of them at this center. And in fact, I was the only other person there. There was 3 inches of snow on the ground too. It wasn't such a great day for visiting, except that the sun was out. Except the guy that sat down next to me in this crumpled old hat with a camera. He turned out to be the guy who established it. So I had a nice talk with him. His name was George Archibald. And in the course of the conversation, he says, and what do you do? And I said, you should ask me what I did rather than what I do now. I'm retired, but what I did was I worked on infectious diseases. And I said, I'm really worried, now that I know that the center is here, I'm worried about your cranes, because West Nile virus is a baddie. And the royal crowned crane will not die. That's an African bird. In fact, I actually saw that bird once in Kenya, so I know where it comes from. But the sandhill cranes are certainly susceptible to this, and so are a lot of the other species. Siberian cranes, there's only about, he said there are about 50 left. And he was involved in the recovery of the whooping crane. You hate big oil, right? Everybody here hates big oil, right? Except the American AMCO, the American Oil Company, right? AMOCO, AMOCO. They were the ones that funded the research that got the crane back on its feet. It was at one point 11 individuals, and now there are over 500. That's amazing, isn't it? What do you think the genetics of that is? When the MHC complex comes down to 11 individuals, I think they're all inbred. And now I asked him, has anybody been doing the genetics of this? Because they're now radiating back out again. What's the mutation rate in whooping cranes? Because they better mutate fast enough to become resistant to the, well, that's not going to happen either. At any rate, that's my biggest worry, is the exotic bird recovery species. In this country, we have a Condor Recovery Act also going on now, further west. And I actually got a call from them a long time ago asking what the chances were that their birds would get nailed by this infection. Where are they located? Right in the middle of the hottest, driest area that you can imagine, Lake Powell. So that's got potential at least, but it's in the middle of nowhere. So there are no people, so there are no mosquitoes, so therefore they're pretty safe, I think. So what's next? Don't know. So that's basically my presentation. So now where you can open it up to discussion. And you can find out just how much virology I don't know. You already know more than I do. I can tell you this right now. If you want to feel really good about yourselves for having gone through this course, you know much more virology than I do. Why? Because I tried to answer your exam. And I knew about the 7 different replication ways of a viral genome, but there was a lot of other stuff that I just didn't know. So I'm throwing myself at your feet and begging for mercy. But please ask questions. Yes? Say it again. That's a great question. You sure? That's the first thing, right? What? Has there been a vaccine developed against the virus? Well, it depends on who you ask, but I know who to ask, because Tom Monath is a friend of mine. Tom Monath used to be at Harvard. He's a virologist. He studies dengue. He got involved in he made Immuvax. I think the company's name is Immuvax, but making vaccines against exotic infections. And he decided to do one against the West Nile virus, but it actually wasn't for people. It was for horses. Huh? Horses? Well, has anybody ever been doing an equestrian event? They're wonderful, aren't they? They're jumpers, and they're, everything is beautiful. But have you ever been to a horse race? Never been to a horse race. I can take you to who controls the racing industry. I can tell you who that is too. So a vaccine for horses, because if you don't have vaccines for horses, Europe will not bring their horses here. They keep their horses away from the outbreaks in southern Europe. But they could always come here, because it never mattered, right? And a little bit for Eastern equine encephalitis, that's not a good disease for them to get, nor is Western. But they could come at a time when those diseases were not in transmission cycle. But West Nile scared the heck out of them. So they've been working on a vaccine. Forget the people. It's about the horses. It's about the money, follow the money. And that's, I'm sorry to say this, but that's exactly the development of that vaccine is for horses, not for people. And it hasn't worked out very well. They tried to piggyback that onto an attenuated yellow fever virus because that's the best vaccine in the world, bar none, for viruses. It was one of the first. It's an attenuated viral vaccine. They just passage it through animals until it doesn't kill them anymore, and then you use that. And it worked. They don't know why, but it did. So if you take this and you insert the genome for the capsid for West Nile, that should offer some protection against West Nile too, but they're still playing with it. See, I don't know anything about virology. I know that much. That's not a lot, though. Yes?
What are the clinical signs of West Nile, and how is it different in during diagnosis from others?
Yeah, that's a great question, too, because how would you know if you had it, and how could you make a decision in a clinical situation which has nothing to do with doing a test? So they call that a syndrome. So there's a West Nile syndrome now that they can actually teach physicians to recognize. Mental confusion, muscle weakness, fever. 3 things. That's it. If someone comes into the hospital nowadays with those 3 signs and symptoms, that's West Nile until proven otherwise. And they didn't get it wrong. So what would you do for it then? For kids, you won't even know they had it because they don't get that sick. But for an adult of my age, you should give me steroids. If you give me steroids, what's that going to do? It's going to keep the inflammation of my brain down. It won't keep the infection from going on. It won't keep my brain cells from being killed. You probably never tell the difference before and after anyway, so that's fine. But we don't use that much of our brain, so I can afford a little bit to the West Nile virus. But the swelling that occurs during the encephalitis is what kills you. And you go into a coma and you die. That's what does it. So if you get the diagnosis early enough and you start supportive therapy, as it's called, not antivirals, not any of that fancy stuff that you can think about using, just supportive therapy plus steroids, you save lives. So part of this reduction in mortality was a quick response of clinicians alerted by public health notification that it's been hot and dry for the last week. Be on the lookout for the first case of West Nile. An early warning system. That's probably all we need, except in Texas. We need a new governor in Texas, I think. Yes?
So there are no tests for it to check for antibodies?
Yeah, there are. Plenty of them.
Okay, so you can prove that someone has.
You could do that. Yeah, that would be an easy one. You could even culture it if you wanted. But most of them are done presumptively now. They do that a lot in Africa for malaria. When a patient comes in and they've got a big spleen, because you can feel it, In most of them you can feel it, not in me, they would never find it. But in some people they could find the spleen and it's way below the costal margin and it's big. They call it big spleen disease. As long as your liver isn't swollen, it has to be just spleen, because otherwise this could be another disease. They can do surveys for malaria just by feeling for the spleens in little kids. And if they find it, they do a mass treatment of the whole village. And it works. You know, you can keep it down this way, right? Until resistance occurs, and that's, of course, happening all over the place now. So we're a little bit worried about overuse of any anti-anythings. There must be other questions. Here's the biggest question that I hoped you would ask, but perhaps I can prod you into this. Why should we care about this anymore? This is a non-issue. Try to get on the news agencies. Nobody wants to hear about this. There's an outbreak of West Nile, big deal. Who cares? It's way below the radar screen. It's on the 3rd page of the news of note section of the social register. Oh, and oh, by the way, Jones died of West Nile, but, you know. It's like hearing about Lyme disease. Everybody's used to it. You get habituated to the information, and you don't react. This is a flavivirus. Listen to the other flaviviruses: yellow fever, dengue, Japanese bee encephalitis. This was introduced into this country at a single point. And now we know where it went. We know how it got there. We know all those details. So you want to do some research on this. So you call up the CDC and you say, I would like the records for the outbreaks of 2006, 2007. I want a GPS designation for each case, and I want the time it occurred. Because I've got an hypothesis as to how this might have all gotten together to form the epidemiologic basis for the outbreak. And they'll say, well, you can get all that information from the state health authorities. Okay. Let's see, which state would you pick? The one with the most cases. Fine, call up Nebraska. Oh, I'm sorry, we can't give you that information. We'll have to call the Centers for Disease Control for that. And so you just start doing this. And the reason why you can't get that information, as I learned at a meeting at the Institute of Medicine, and this was the only closed-door meeting they had in 20 years. This could be used by bioterrorists to introduce a vector-borne disease, and they know what the pattern is now. So they could try something like this with a much more virulent organism. So you're worried about bioterrorism, just something to just file that away and, oh my God, I never even thought about that. I was worried about where my next meal was going to come from. It's true, though, because the government actually ends up controlling this information. And I tried really hard through students and through my own contacts to get that information so that I could work with it and model it. And it's not available to the public, or even to the private. It's not available to investigators. And I had a chance to talk with somebody in the Homeland Defense Department. I don't even know what they're going to call themselves now, but whatever they think they are. And they said, you're right, this information is not for general consumption because, you know, if your model is right. What do you mean if my model is right? Or how else are you going to find out unless you have the data, right? So can you imagine having that data, and you can just do this mental picture. Take 1999, and then the map is right there. It's not going to change. And there's this little cursor that you can move across, and it goes from 99 to 2011. And as it goes across, the epidemics occur, and at the same time, the drought watch occurs, and at the same time, bird deaths occur, and at the same time, mosquito pool infections occur. And run that movie for me. You can run the movie now. You can make it happen in your mind. You can watch it. You can just press that video. It's got that little triangle, and you can watch it. The weather comes up. If I could have shown you the movie, it would have taken 20 minutes, and we could have been done here, all right? So write your congressman, tell him to release the data so that we can start playing with it. Because if you can't do good science without the data, without the input. We can make up any story we want here, and we can tell it to you as if it's a true story, but unless this is based on reality, you have a right to question it, and you have a right to say, well, that's a partial truth, or that's maybe not even the full truth. So here's the final quote. Did you give them this quote, Vince? Trust science, don't trust scientists. Because we all have our opinions, but science it's not an opinion. It's a way of gathering information and manipulating it. So, thank you.